Hey guys, real quick here before we start, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who made these videos possible. These are sponsored by Square Enix, and the footage contained within is subject to change. But that's it, so let's dive right into Gunbreaker. I played all of the tanks at the Shadowbringers Media Tour, and I gotta say, Gunbreaker impressed me the most. With the removal of enmity combos, each of the tanks has more or less seen their damage rotation doubled in size. Gunbreaker in particular has a veritable onslaught of weapon skills that leaves you feeling like a total badass. Without any further delay, let's just dive right into it. First up is the job gauge, and this is a very straightforward system. You can generate and hold up to 2 cartridges, which can then be spent on 3 separate weapon skills. There are 2 weapon skills that each generate a single cartridge, as well as a single job ability that generates 2. I will note that there is a typo in the job gauge page here. It says Sonic Break generates a cartridge, but what it means to say is Demon Slaughter generates a cartridge. Next up is the initial 3-step combo for Gunbreaker. This starts out with Keen Edge, which is a very simple potency hit. It doesn't have any special effects to it. Keen Edge is followed up by Brutal Shell, and this is a weapon skill that has a little bit more to it. It offers both a small heal as well as a shield that is equal to the amount of HP healed. To give you an example, in the level 74 dungeon, when we were synced down, this was healing me for roughly around 2.5k, which means total it's about 5k mitigation. It's nothing massive, but it's something that is passively generated as you go through your combo. However, this is also comboed with one of your tank cooldowns, which is Heart of Stone. This can be used on yourself to reduce damage by 15% or on another party member. But if you are under the effect of Brutal Shell when you use this on another person, they also get the shield that you generated from Brutal Shell, which again, it isn't massive, but it's something. This, I imagine, isn't something you're probably going to want to go out of your way to sync up, but if it does, for whatever reason, there's a little added bonus. The final step in this combo chain is Solid Barrel, and this is the first weapon skill that adds a cartridge to your powder gauge. That being said, this is a perfect segue into the 3 different weapon skills that do actually use these cartridges. The first 2 that we'll talk about are Burst Strike, which is a single target attack, and Faded Circle, which is an AoE. It is important to note that these do not break combo chains, so they can be woven in between each step of your combo chain. However, they are on the global cooldown, so you cannot weave them in as off global cooldowns. Arguably, the most important of your cartridge expending abilities is Gnashing Fang. This is a weapon skill on a roughly 30-second cooldown that is the beginning of a 6-step combo chain that is executed within 3 global cooldowns. This is paired up with an off-global cooldown known as Continuation. How this works is when you execute Gnashing Fang, you will get a buff that will turn Continuation into Jugular Rip. This then allows you to use Savage Claw, which feeds into Abdomen Tear. Lastly, you have Wicked Talon, which feeds into Eye Gouge. And so, in the end, you end up executing roughly 6 abilities within 3 GCDs. Next, I'll quickly go over Gunbreaker's AoE rotation. It's very simple. You have Demon Slice, which is followed up by Demon Slaughter, which grants a cartridge that can then be used on Faded Circle. You also have an OGCD AoE ability known as Bow Shock, not Bow Shock, it's an astrophysical term, which is a AoE potency hit as well as a damage over time effect. The final 2 weapon skills available to Gunbreaker are Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins, which unfortunately upgrades to Blasting Zone at level 80, which is a high potency OGCD, and Sonic Break, which is a damage over time effect. This, however, is on the global cooldown, but like Burst Strike, it can be woven in between your combos without breaking them. Also, just kidding, I lied. I don't have time to go back and edit the last thing I recorded, but there is one more weapon skill, which is Lightning Shot, and that is your ranged attack. Like the other tanks, Gunbreaker, of course, has a gap closer. This is known as Rough Divide, and as you can see here, it is a part of the charge system. It can have up to a maximum of 2 charges, so you can use 1 for damage potency and keep 1 on standby in case you need movement. And so long as you always spend it before it caps out at 2, you won't have any loss in overall damage throughout the fight. The only exception to this is the following ability, in which you may want to use both charges to maximize your damage output. This ability is called No Mercy, and it increases your damage by 10%. It has a duration of 20 seconds and a recast of 60, which means you can have this up roughly 33% of the time. As I mentioned earlier, you'll likely want to fit as many of your OGCDs as possible into this window, so I imagine a large part of maximizing your damage output on Gunbreaker will be doing your best to make sure things line up properly. The final non-tank cooldown ability that's in Gunbreaker's arsenal is Bloodfest. This is the ability I mentioned earlier in the video that allows you to generate 2 cartridges to your powder gauge so long as you're in combat. As such, this is an ability that can be used to help further enhance your burst capability when it lines up with some of your other buffs. Finally, let's take a second to go over Gunbreaker's defensive cooldowns as well as some associated traits. First up is Royal Guard. This is the Gunbreaker tank stance, and it's a very, very simple thing now. If you turn on your tank stance, you will generate enmity, and you will be able to hold aggro so long as you're attacking. There's no longer a damage penalty. DPS no longer have enmity mitigation tools, so for example, Ninja no longer has Shadewalker or Smoke Bomb. It is entirely on the tank, and the only thing you need to do is toggle on that tank stance. So if you're main tank, it's on. If you're off tank, it's off. The damage reduction that was once on tank stances is now in the form of a trait called Tank Mastery. This is a passive 20% damage reduction on every single tank. Further, there's a maximum HP bonus based on vitality, and an increase to damage based on strength. The first tank cooldown we'll go over is Heart of Stone, which we touched on briefly earlier. This reduces damage taken by 15% on either yourself or a party member, and if you are under the effect of the shield Brutal Shell, it will apply that shield to the person you cast it on as well. This is a fantastic tank cooldown, primarily because of its relatively short cooldown. At 25 seconds, you can have this up for just about every single raid-wide AoE or tank buster. So whether you're the main tank or the off tank, you have a lot of defensive capability stemming from just this one single ability. Next is Aurora, and this is a really interesting choice of tank cooldown. It has an initial cure attached to it, as well as a regen effect, and this can be used on either yourself or on another party member. Synced down at level 74, the initial cure was about 5.5k on average, followed up by roughly 20 to 25,000 in regen, which overall winds up being about a third of your HP at that level. So it is a fairly potent regen, and when you consider it being stacked up with regens from the healers, it'll be really interesting to see how this pans out in endgame content. Nebula is very straightforward and doesn't really need much discussion. It is a 30% damage reduction ability on a 2-minute cooldown with a 10-second duration. So essentially, it is your Vengeance, Sentinel, or Shadow Wall. Heart of Light is Gunbreaker's primary raid-wide AoE mitigation. This reduces damage taken by yourself and nearby party members by 15% and has a 15-second duration with a 90-second recast. Again, there isn't really much else to say about this. It's very straightforward and simple. If you expect heavy raid-wide AoE damage, you use Heart of Light. Now, let's talk about what is, in my opinion, one of Gunbreaker's weakest cooldowns. Again, like everything else in this video, it is entirely subject to change. I'd like to think it likely will, because it does seem a little underwhelming right now. Camouflage is an ability that increases your parry rate by 50% while reducing damage taken by 10%, with a 20-second duration and a 90-second recast. It just doesn't really seem that powerful, especially when compared to some of the other tank cooldowns. 50% parry rate is great and all, but it doesn't really make up for the fact that it only reduces damage by 10%. While it will have a very high uptime, making it fantastic for auto attacks, it does eat up one of Gunbreaker's damage reduction slots, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, but again, it's really hard to come to a solid conclusion right now because we haven't had a chance to experience Gunbreaker in real substantial content. So while on paper it seems a little bit underwhelming, we'll just have to wait and see. And last but certainly not least, we have Super Bolide. This is the Gunbreaker's tank ultimate, and like Camouflage, I was left a little underwhelmed. Super Bolide reduces your HP to 1, but then it renders you impervious to most attacks. This functions in the same manner as Hollowed Ground. However, it only has a duration of 8 seconds and a recast of 420. So to recap, Hollowed Ground has a duration of 10 seconds, keeps you at whatever HP you're at when you execute it, and has a recast of 420. So Super Bolide lasts 2 seconds less, has the same cooldown, and an HP penalty. It just doesn't really add up. In fact, I brought this up in my interview with Yoshi P, and he had something interesting to say, but I'll save the bulk of that for my interview video. Suffice it to say, maybe Hallowed Ground is a little overpowered, but it's hard to fix it, because if they nerfed it, people would be upset, so it's kind of in a rough spot. Honestly, if they shaved off anywhere from 45 seconds to a minute on its cooldown, I think it might be a little easier of a pill to swallow, but as I've said many times, this is a test build. Things can and will likely undergo significant changes, and hopefully Super Bolide is one of those. I'd also like to gloss over the roll ability system, as this has seen some change. We no longer have access to Anticipation, Ultimatum, or Convalescence. However, we do have access to Arm's Length, which means every single tank now has knockback prevention, which is a very welcome change. The rest of the abilities have remained relatively unchanged, if not entirely unchanged, so there's not much else to worry about here. So now that we have all of that information out of the way, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Gunbreaker. Some of you may be aware, but I've been a tank main more or less as long as I've played this game. As far back as 1.0, I was a gladiator when I started the game in early access. I raided on warrior at the end of 1.0. I raided on warrior in ARR, Dark Knight in Heaven's Ward, and paladin and warrior and Dark Knight in Stormblood. My initial impressions with Gunbreaker were very positive. I'm really happy with it. It feels great. It looks great. For any of you Final Fantasy VIII fans out there, I'm sure you are over the moon, as it is, I mean, all the abilities, right? It's fantastic. It's a really, really interesting tank. Up until now, the most aggressive tank we've had has been Warrior, but even then, it was a slow and cumbersome tank. It was a heavy hitter. Gunbreaker, on the other hand, is fast-paced. It's intense. And it feels like you're just throwing out a flurry of non-stop combo chains and weapon skills, which lends itself to a playstyle that we've never really seen before in a tank, because for the most part, they've always been rather slow on the GCD, and while Gunbreaker does also share that slower GCD, it's mixed up by the fact that you have so many other abilities to use in between. Now, one could argue Dark Knight was also sort of that way, but I feel like Dark Arts was just something else entirely. They don't feel like they play the same. For example, right now I'm playing Dark Knight on live servers with Stormblood, and compared to Gunbreaker, night and day. Not to mention, Gunbreaker's toolkit is unlike anything we've really ever had before. We've never had a tank with a regen, and that's going to be, I mean, who knows how that's going to work out, right? Well, I am curious about the design choices of a few of the abilities, namely Camouflage and Super Bolide. I am still stoked to get my hands on this job, and I think it's my new main. From what I experienced, I'm definitely leveling this first. I'm really looking forward to trying it out in endgame content and seeing what adjustments they make to it moving forward. So in closing, I would once again like to say thank you so much to everybody who made this video possible. Thank you for watching and listening. As always, I can't stress it enough. It means the world to me, and I really appreciate each and every one of you. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed Gunbreaker as much as I did. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them below. I will do my best to answer them. I'm going to be all over the place on Twitter and Twitch, doing shows, podcasts, etc. So if you see me, feel free to pick my brain. And if I have the time, I will do my best to answer any of your questions. Of course, it wouldn't be one of my job videos if I didn't have a little something else for you. I hope you enjoy it.